They were never meant to be compared. Season 16 of Gold Rush appeared routine at first. Steady production, familiar challenges, nothing that raised alarms. But that illusion collapsed when a quiet comparison surfaced, one no one was supposed to make. There was no massive excavation or dramatic find. Instead, Chris Doumitt noticed something hidden in plain sight. The numbers, figures that were always kept separate, were suddenly viewed together. And the moment they were, a pattern emerged that couldn't be ignored. Ground officially labeled as worked out began delivering richer gold. Pay streaks appeared in places where the geology said there should be nothing left. And when the calculations were finally run, even the most cautious estimates pointed to something enormous, close to $195 million still locked inside a system everyone assumed was finished. This wasn't luck. It wasn't a forgotten pocket. It was evidence that the ground itself had been shaped to preserve gold over decades. What Season 16 exposed by accident wasn't just value, it was control. And once a system like that is revealed, the entire future of the operation has to be reconsidered. This wasn't luck. It wasn't a forgotten pocket. It was proof the ground itself had been shaped to preserve gold over decades. What Season 16 exposed, almost by accident, wasn't just hidden value, it was control. And once a system like that is revealed, the future of the entire operation has to be reconsidered. They were never meant to compare these figures. And before we go any further, hit like and subscribe, because once you understand what Season 16 quietly uncovered, Gold Rush will never feel the same again. It started with what looked like a routine cleanup. No drama, no raised voices, no tense music. Just Chris Doumitt at the sluice boxes, doing what he's done longer than nearly anyone else out there, reading gold. But the results coming out of those cleanups didn't behave the way they should have. Not according to the cut plans, not according to depletion models, and not according to the documented history of that ground. The haul totals were oddly consistent, not spiking, not fluctuating, just steadily heavy in areas that should have been tapering off weeks earlier. These were zones already marked as stripped, areas that on paper had given up everything years ago. Yet the gold wasn't thinning. It was getting denser. The deeper they dug into what should have been dead ground, the richer it became. That's the opposite of how placer systems are supposed to behave. At first, Chris keeps it to himself. A quiet note here, a side-by-side comparison there. Experience tells you to treat this kind of thing as an outlier. Yukon ground is unpredictable. False bottoms happen. Missed pockets exist. One strange cleanup doesn't mean anything, so production shrugs it off, chalk it up to a good day, and move on. Except it doesn't end there. The same pattern appears again, then again. Different cuts, different locations, same results. Gold per yard stays stable. Grain size doesn't change. There's no sign of depletion. The numbers refuse to taper, the way every mined-out channel in the Yukon always does. And once a pattern repeats, it stops being random. That's when things get uncomfortable. What Chris is seeing isn't a hot streak. It's a system behaving as if it's being refilled, or more accurately, as if it was never emptied to begin with. That's when the old maps come out. Legacy claim maps are unforgiving. They don't exaggerate and they don't soften the truth. They show where early miners worked, where modern crews stripped, and where nothing worth chasing was left behind. The area now producing this gold is clearly marked as exhausted, mined through, crosscut, finished. According to those records, any remaining gold should be nothing more than trace dust. But that's not what's coming out. When Chris overlays modern recovery data onto those maps, The contradiction is obvious. Pay streaks aren't just continuing. They're showing up outside the known channel, off to the side, above it in some places, below it in others. The geometry doesn't make sense. Natural placer channels follow gravity, water flow, and time. These don't. They curve, disappear, reappear. They break every rule. And that's when the problem stops being geological. If erosion were responsible, the gold would thin out. Grain size would shrink. Where patterns would show long-distance travel. But none of that is happening. What the data suggests isn't movement. It's placement. The channel isn't wandering. It's segmented, broken into sections that look intentionally separated, as if someone long ago didn't want all the gold concentrated in one place. That's when the uncomfortable idea surfaces. Someone altered it. Not recently. Not with modern equipment. This wasn't a dozer mistake or a sloppy strip job. The scale is too clean, too deliberate. Whatever reshaped this system happened before modern maps, before standardized claims, before drones and spreadsheets ever arrived on site, and Season 16 is quietly brushing up against the edges of it. By the third week of seeing the same behavior, Chris stops treating the numbers as coincidence and starts treating them like evidence. He looks past totals and focuses on character, because gold tells a story if you know how to read it. Sharp edges mean short travel. Rounded grains mean distance. Mixed sizes usually point to reworked ground. But this gold is uniform, week after week, cut after cut, same size, same wear, same behavior. That shouldn't happen in a natural system, no matter how rich. Over time, consistency breaks down. The best material comes first, then the leftovers, then the fines. But here, nothing is degrading. Nothing is thinning. It's as if they're accessing layers that were never disturbed, layers that were sealed. Under magnification, the confirmation is unmistakable. These pieces didn't tumble for miles. They didn't cycle through floods. They settled and stayed there, protected, locked in place. This isn't gold that wandered into a trap. It's gold that was preserved. And that realization changes the meaning of the entire season. This isn't a strike. It's not a pocket. It's not a lucky year. Those burn out fast. What Season 16 is touching is something far larger and far older, a preserved system, one built to survive surface mining, modern stripping, and decades of activity without revealing itself. The most unsettling part isn't how much gold is appearing. It's how much clearly hasn't yet. Once you recognize a system like this, every number you've seen stops being the reward and starts being the warning. And because the scale is so massive, production can't treat it casually anymore. Certain figures quietly stop appearing on camera, not because they're wrong, but because they're too important to show. Detailed recovery ratios fade into vague phrases. Solid cleanup, better than expected. The math behind those words never makes it to the screen, concealing the true size of what's been uncovered. And while the operation adjusts behind the scenes, Chris notices immediately. Raw totals stop being discussed at the wash plant. Instead of being logged and reviewed in real time, the numbers begin to disappear, right when they matter most. The delays become noticeable. Sometimes the numbers surface days later, sometimes not until the cuts are already filled back in. The gold is still weighed, still logged. Nothing disappears, but the process slips out of view. What was once openly tracked becomes carefully filtered. This isn't editing for excitement, it's editing for containment. The reason is simple. Scale. Once production numbers pass a certain point, they stop being entertainment and start becoming exposure. Large gold draws more than fan attention. It attracts landowners, partners, regulators, and rivals. Explaining why a single stretch of ground is outperforming every historical benchmark raises questions no one wants to answer on television. So, the show doesn't explain it. Time gets compressed. Context gets flattened. Data turns into vague narrative beats instead of hard evidence. Chris understands exactly what that signals. This isn't about covering up an error. It's about shielding magnitude, the kind that can't be undone once it's public. If viewers can notice the pattern, so can anyone with legal or financial leverage, and that's when the nature of the digging itself begins to change. As cuts go deeper, a new signal appears, one you only catch when you stop focusing on totals and start tracking depth. The gold spikes aren't random. They repeat at strikingly consistent intervals, roughly every 90 feet vertically, not sideways, straight down. Each time the operation hits a structural clay break, the same sequence plays out. A sudden jump in gold weight, followed by stability, then another spike at the next clay layer. That doesn't happen naturally. Water doesn't deposit gold in evenly spaced vertical layers sealed by clay unless something disrupts the flow. These aren't stacked flood events. The spacing is too clean, too intentional. It looks less like sedimentation and more like storage logic. Chris compares notes across cuts, across weeks, across different sections of the claim. Same depth, same behavior. Over and over. The clay layers act as seals, locking material beneath them. But the gold isn't smeared or diffused the way pressure over time should cause. It's concentrated, preserved, almost untouched, as if those breaks weren't geological accidents, but boundaries. That word starts circulating quietly, not spoken on camera, but understood by anyone paying attention. Each clay layer isn't just a barrier, it's a marker, a stopping point, a place where movement was intentionally halted. Old-timer diversion logic wasn't about pulling everything as fast as possible. It was about control, slowing loss, protecting value, creating reserves that could survive surface disturbance. This ground wasn't simply mined, it was managed. That implication changes everything. It suggests the richest material was never meant to be extracted quickly. It was designed to be shielded from erosion, from theft, even from future miners who wouldn't recognize the system. The gold wasn't hidden deep. It was hidden intelligently, protected by structural defenses that modern stripping almost overlooks because it assumes depletion happens straight down, not in stages. Once Chris sees that, his approach shifts. Early in the season, he questioned, flagged inconsistencies, pushed for clarity. Now he stops pushing altogether, not because the data vanished, but because it became too dangerous to mishandle. Lease agreements suddenly matter more. Claim boundaries stop being abstract lines and start looking like pressure points. A discovery of this size, if formally acknowledged, could reopen contracts, trigger audits, or draw in people who were never meant to be involved. Silence becomes protection. Chris understands that saying the wrong thing at the wrong time doesn't just affect a storyline, it affects ownership. Once a preserved system like this is officially recognized, it stops being a season highlight and becomes an asset others will try to control. Partners renegotiate. Landholders demand answers. Lawyers appear. Compared to that, production schedules mean nothing. So the strategy changes. Let the show continue. Let the edits simplify. Let the gold come out slowly, quietly. The system is safest if it looks ordinary. The last thing they want is undeniable proof on camera that this ground breaks every historical model. Because once that proof is public, Control shifts away from the people standing at the wash plant. That's when the math becomes unavoidable, but it has to be done carefully. Chris doesn't need everything opened at once. He only needs reference points, exposed walls, consistent density, repeating depth intervals. From there, volume tells the story. He calculates only what's visible. No speculation, no hidden layers. Confirmed pay multiplied by lateral spread. Even that number is enormous, more than most full seasons produce. But the real calculation begins when he accounts for what hasn't been touched. Modern mining rarely goes straight down all at once. It steps down season by season. In this case, that means entire sections of the preserved system still exist below current working depth. Chris adjusts for that reality. He uses conservative assumptions, worst-case recovery, broken continuity. Even then, the estimate climbs into 9 figures. That's the moment the discussion stops being theoretical. More aggressive models, those that assume continuity across the preserved structure, push the value even higher, nearing $195 million in recoverable gold. Not hype, not promotional math, just volume multiplied by consistency. And that's why no one wants that number spoken aloud, because once it exists, it reframes everything happening on screen. Season 16 stops being about a strong year. It becomes about confirmation, proof the system exists, proof it survived modern mining, proof the ground is worth protecting, not rushing. The gold, already recovered, becomes secondary. It's evidence, not the reward. That shift explains what follows on site, even if the show never explains it directly. Equipment deployment changes almost overnight. Cuts that should logically go deeper suddenly pause. Instead of driving straight into the richest zones, new cuts appear along the edges. Lighter passes replace aggressive stripping. Material is handled more carefully. Total yardage drops, but gold per yard rises. To a casual viewer, it might look like hesitation or risk aversion. It's neither. It's preservation. They're no longer trying to maximize immediate output. They're trying not to damage the structure that makes the system valuable. Heavy stripping risks, collapsing clay seals, over-excavation risks, blending layers that were meant to stay separate. Once those boundaries are destroyed, the advantage disappears, so they mine around it. Access points target edges instead of cores. The richest material is left partially intact while surrounding ground is removed. The system stays readable, measurable, controlled. Speed no longer matters. Stability does. That's the part viewers never hear. What looks like restraint is actually long-term planning. The operation starts behaving less like miners chasing ounces and more like caretakers managing an asset. And that's when the past snaps into focus. Chris recognizes the logic immediately because he's seen it before. In old Yukon techniques, most modern crews dismiss as outdated. Methods built not for fast extraction, but for continuity. Old-timers didn't always take everything at once. They diverted, sealed, staged, and returned years later. Their goal wasn't a single season's total. It was longevity. Those methods weren't primitive. They were patient. The same thinking is embedded in this ground. Layered access. Controlled release. Structural barriers meant to survive disturbance. This wasn't desperation mining, it was foresight. The original miners understood something modern operations often forget. Gold protected is gold preserved for those who know how to read the system. Leases change, crews rotate, equipment upgrades. But this ground doesn't respond to seasons. It responds to strategy, and that strategy is being rediscovered in real time. History isn't repeating itself. it's asserting itself. This preserved system isn't a geological accident or a stroke of luck. It's the result of deliberate decisions made long before cameras, contracts, or modern machinery. Season 16 didn't just uncover gold, it uncovered intent. And once that intent is understood, every move on site becomes deliberate. Because when you realize you're standing on something designed to last decades, you stop acting like time is running out. Chris knows observation alone isn't enough. A theory of preservation needs confirmation, and that confirmation doesn't arrive with a dramatic moment or a massive cleanup. The confirmation doesn't come from a massive dig or a dramatic reveal. It comes from something far more subtle, a narrow probe, small enough to leave the surrounding structure undisturbed, yet accurate enough to answer the only question that matters. When the material is brought up, Chris doesn't need a full wash to understand what he's seeing. The pay is pure, clean, untouched. It carries the same grain size, the same weight distribution, the same wear patterns as the gold already recovered, but without any signs of movement or blending. That detail changes everything. It proves the preserved system wasn't just theoretical. It's still whole. If this layer had ever been exposed, even briefly, the gold would show it. Edges would be rounded. Fine material would dominate. Density would fall off. But none of that appears. The material sat exactly where it was meant to, shielded by the same clay boundaries that defined every earlier spike. No seepage, no collapse, no contamination from above. The seal held. The system isn't broken. It isn't fading. It isn't partially gone. It's intact. That realization forces a total shift in perspective. Everything recovered up to this point stops being treated as production and starts being understood for what it really was: sampling, proof of life, confirmation that the structure still functions exactly as intended. The true value of the system, the core reserves that give it meaning, hasn't been touched. Once that becomes clear, speed stops mattering to anyone outside the operation. Precision takes over. Season 17 won't look louder or bigger. It will look quieter, slower. Fewer explosive moments, fewer oversized cleanups, less urgency on camera. But beneath that calm surface, something far more consequential is underway. Gold per yard will climb, even as total yardage drops. Data collection will outweigh production targets. Every cut becomes a test. Every pass becomes a measurement. Instead of forcing the ground to reveal itself, the crew watches how it responds. Brute force gives way to risk control. In a normal season, a mistake might cost ounces. Here, it could cost tens of millions. The most important work happens in restraint, in the pauses, in the decisions not to dig. To an outsider, it may look like caution, fatigue, or even decline. It's none of those. The operation has crossed a threshold where gold itself is no longer the objective. Control is control over access, control over timing, control over information. Because once a preserved system like this is openly acknowledged, it stops being just a mining success. It becomes leverage. Whoever understands it decides how and when it's used. Season 16 was never about pulling as much gold as possible. It was about proving the system survived long enough to matter. That's the realization that finally settles in for Chris. This isn't a jackpot to cash in. It's a mechanism, one that, once understood, can outlast any crew, any season, any contract. The real value isn't just in what comes out of the ground. It's in knowing how to extract it without destroying what makes it valuable. Season 16 wasn't the payoff. It was the signal. A warning shot that something far larger exists beneath the surface, structured in a way that rewards patience and punishes recklessness. The real extraction hasn't started because it doesn't have to. Not yet. But now that the proof exists, now that the system has been confirmed beyond doubt, the conditions that kept it hidden can't hold forever. Knowledge changes behavior. Behavior reshapes outcomes. And once enough people understand what this ground truly represents, everything built on top of it will have to adapt. Because systems like this don't just change seasons, they change who's in control.